Susan and Patty are both dear friends, so all that was biased. And thanks to all the PON and CPL folks who helped put this event together. I'm married to somebody in the back. That's Marla. So when the talk's over, the reason I'm telling you this is that I'd still be happy to explain to you after the talk that I really am studying something that I'm terrible at noticing. Okay? I'm quite oblivious to the world, and so I wrote a book on sort of my attempt to go from being a terrible noticer to a mediocre noticer, and I think it's a really important journey, and that's what I want to share with you. And I'm going to share a few episodes of my terrible noticing with you. And one of them has to do with a tobacco story. And it's going to take a little while to develop that, but I hope you find the story interesting anyhow. So 1 month to the day after his impeachment, by the way, I'm reading from a book called Bad Acts by Sharon Eubanks and Stanton Glantz. 1 month to the day after his impeachment by the House of Representatives, President Bill Clinton gave his State of the Union address, and he said, "Now I ask this Congress to resist the tobacco lobby, to reaffirm the FDA's authority to protect children from tobacco, and to hold the tobacco companies accountable. Smoking has cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars under Medicare and other programs. So tonight I announced that the Justice Department is preparing a litigation plan to take the tobacco companies to court, and with the funds we recover, to strengthen Medicare." So I don't really recall whether I was watching the State of the Union that night, but I certainly didn't know that that event would have any effect on me. But it did. So basically, as a result of President Clinton's announcement, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a suit against the entire tobacco industry in 1999. Since due to location, there's probably a bunch of lawyers in the room, so if I get anything wrong, yell, scream, correct me. They filed this lawsuit under something called RICO, which is a racketeering act, and it was basically a set of laws that the U.S. government created to go after the mafia. And in short form, RICO is harder to prove than most civil crimes, but if you prove guilt under RICO, it allows for penalties that go beyond traditional penalties. So it was really created so the U.S. government could potentially take over mafia-run companies, restructure them, and then send them on their way. But under RICO, as I understand it, you need to both prove fraud and a conspiracy to commit fraud. And in this case, the frauds that the tobacco industry were accused of are up there. So this is not mine. This is the lawsuit that was filed. And you'll notice that basically it says they did bad things while denying doing so. And while denying doing so is critical to the claim that they were guilty of fraud. And then they were also accused of using a conspiracy across multiple organizations to commit those frauds. So basically, this lawsuit was filed in 1999. It really got started in 2004. In February of 2005, an appeals court decided that the Department of Justice could not go after the primary remedy that it was seeking. And the primary remedy it was seeking was $280 billion for basically the costs that the U.S. government had incurred as a result of the fraudulent behavior of selling cigarettes in fraudulent ways. And the appeals court decided that the Department of Justice was not entitled to go after that primary remedy because it was backward-looking. And they argued that any RICO remedy had to be forward-looking, and they judged that to be a backward-looking remedy, and it was taken off the table. So in February of 2005, the Department of Justice litigation team, headed up by Sharon Eubanks, whose book I was reading from just a few minutes ago, found itself thinking that they were winning the case, and their main remedy had just been pulled apart. So they developed a couple of new remedies. They were requesting $130 billion for programs to get people to stop smoking cigarettes. And then a young attorney, Harvard Law School graduate, who was part of the DOJ team, found me. And he found me having to do with some work that I had done having to do with the auditing industry. And he thought that I might be useful to this case. So it was on March 10th, 2005, I was hired as a remedy witness. And the core argument that I made was that in addition to the potential of tobacco companies to intentionally mislead the public, the goals of the market system would drive these companies to self-serving interpretations of their acts, allowing them to engage in misrepresentation beyond their own awareness. I'm not going to spend much time on that because this is just kind of background. And my testimony concluded with the argument that absent significant court intervention, misconduct would continue into the future. My recommendation was based on the assumption that the DOJ had proven liability. And in my testimony, I said that like 142 times or something like that. I was continually told my job was not to prove their guilt, my job was to talk about remedies. So I always was saying, based on the assumption that the DOJ had proven liability, was that the court should appoint monitors to the tobacco companies to consider appropriate structural changes, not limited to, but including the removal of senior management. This led to a variety of interesting discussions, but I wasn't a particularly popular person among the tobacco industry. So here's a quick chronology. I was hired on March 10th. I was hired being told that due to the fact that they were under a tight time constraint because of what had happened with the elimination of the $280 billion remedy, that they needed a report quickly, which I provided on March 21st. On April 10th, I was deposed for 7 hours by 10 attorneys sitting across from me, including one person who just sat there right across from me looking mean the whole time. The lawyers probably know about that. In mid-April, I submitted my written direct testimony. So the judge had decided for efficiency reasons that the direct testimony would be submitted in writing. That is, the questions that the DOJ would ask me would be in writing, my response would be in writing. So that was submitted in mid-April. And then I showed up on April 30th, and this is actually the key event that I want to sort of tell you about. On April 30th, I showed up in Washington, D.C. to prep for my upcoming appearance in court on May 4th. And the attorney who was in charge of my testimony, again, a young, fairly recent Harvard Law School graduate, and when I met him on March 10th, he's a very polite guy. It took about a week or so to get him to quit calling me Professor Bazerman and switch to Max. And everybody calls me Max. And so by somewhere, certainly by the end of March, he was calling me Max. And on April 30th, I was meeting with him at the DOJ, and he came into the conference room. He sat down. He looked at me very, very seriously. And he said, Professor Bazerman. My ears kind of rang. He said, Professor Bazerman, the Department of Justice requests that you amend your testimony to note that it would not be relevant if any of the following 4 legal conditions existed. He then read me 4 different legal conditions, none of which I was even close to understanding. And he asked me to accept that my testimony would not be relevant if any of the 4 existed. And I said to him, I'm a little bit confused. Why do you think that I would say yes to this, given that you know me well enough to know that I didn't understand what you just said? And that if I did understand what you just said, I'd probably say no. He said, because if you don't say yes, there's a significant chance that my superiors will remove you from the witness list before you testify on Wednesday. At this point, I had, I think, spent 166 hours working on this case at your expense. Eventually, it was 214 hours total. I said, okay, so I don't amend my testimony. And he smiled, and said, good, let's prepare in case you're still on the stand on Wednesday. Now, the lawyers probably have a better idea what was going on than I did at the time, but I was completely baffled. It certainly seemed like something very bad had just occurred, but I didn't know exactly what. And it's also fair to say that this period of time was the busiest time in my life. Sort of, my mother had terminal cancer, my sister had breast cancer, and I had committed to a workload that was just it was just ridiculous. So I was busy, so I'm giving you my excuse. But I thought something very bad had happened, and I didn't know exactly what to do about it. I didn't think about it very long, and besides, I had to get ready to testify on the 4th. So I show up on the 4th, and the first thing that happens on May 4th is that tobacco attorneys file a Daubert motion. And I'll give you my informal understanding of Daubert. I'm sure that we have Daubert experts in the room, but my understanding is you can question their rights to use a witness based on either their field of study is not a legitimate science or they're not an expert in that area. And they filed a Daubert challenge. The judge asked for clarity, whether is the problem with the field or his expertise, and they said both. So they argued for this a little bit, and I'm still waiting to get on the stand. And I'm not a regular expert witness. This is not, I don't do much of this work. And finally the judge decides that she's not going to roll, that I'll testify that day, but she wanted reports from both sides by 2 days later, Friday, on whether or not the Daubert challenge should be upheld. Okay. So after I spent the day testifying, the next task was to prepare for the Daubert challenge to show that behavioral decision research was a legitimate science and that I wasn't clueless about the topic. So that kept us busy here, and then I was busy helping to prepare for the cross-examination of my opposite. The main point here is just I was busy. Okay. So life went on. Okay. 2 days later, the judge rules that my field's okay and I'm not clueless. Okay, so I'll come back to that in just a little bit and talk about where I think that I really goofed in that story. But first I want to tell you about another episode. And many of you have seen this, but others have seen something like this. And so I'm going to do this in very short form. The task here is I'm going to show you 2 videos at the same time. One has 3 players in white t-shirts passing a basketball to each other. The other has 3 players in dark t-shirts passing a different basketball to each other. So I'll promise you in advance, no player in a white t-shirt will pass a basketball to a player in a dark t-shirt. No player in a dark t-shirt will pass a basketball to a player in a white t-shirt because they're in different videos. Your task across 18 seconds is to count the passes among the players in the white t-shirts. And with that, you can begin counting. Okay, now for the well-focused among you, the correct answer was 11. Okay, so some of you are happy, others are not. Okay, and the more interesting question is whether or not you noticed the clearly visible woman with an umbrella who walked from the screen from the right to the left. And most people do not see her, so I'll just play the video again. Don't bother to count, just watch. It's the same video. Okay. Now, so this video was made by Ulrich Neisser in the 1970s. I did not see it until I was kind of in your situation. I was in an audience. My colleague and friend Bazerman was giving a talk in 2003. She played the video. I correctly counted the passes as 11. I'm good at focusing. And then she played the video again. And the fact that I didn't notice a woman with the umbrella until the second time has been my obsession for the last 11 years. Okay. But there's lots of reasons to explain why I wouldn't notice. Now, some of you, by the way, went into this looking for a gorilla. Okay. And the reason for that is that Ulrich Neisser had a student by the name of Dan Simons who made a better version, a better viewing version of this. And instead of having a woman with an umbrella, there's a woman dressed in a gorilla outfit who comes to the middle, thumps her chest and keeps on going. The hit rate on gorilla is higher than the hit rate on woman with the umbrella. But the more interesting part I find, and the reason I show you this one, is the gorilla ones become very famous. And there's an awful lot of people who say, I'm going to try to count and see the gorilla. And generally looking for gorillas interrupt your ability to count, and those people don't see the one with the umbrella either. Okay. But that's a fun one, okay? But there's more important ones. Like you have basically these facts, and this is information from a book I wrote with Michael Watkins in 2004 called Predictable Surprises. But basically you have a bunch of pieces that I would argue should have led the US government to notice that we should have fixed airline security long before 9/11 ever occurred. I give the long-winded version of that, but you can go read that. But I think that we should have noticed this, okay? I also think that we should have noticed that the US government has created an auditing system that guarantees that the one thing that auditors won't provide is independence, which is a little bit peculiar because the only reason auditing firms exist is to provide independence, but since they want to sell their services or resell their services, since they want to sell consulting services, since they want to take jobs with their client firm, they're no more capable of being independent than a parent would be of telling you how smart their child is. When we have a self-interest in seeing the world in a particular way, our potential for objectivity largely goes away. Now, this is the participant, this is the second participant part, or the first for those of you who already saw the one with the umbrella video. So this is an investment problem that you all need to work on. This is over a 10-year period. This is the return of the S&P 500, okay? And your job is you're an investment advisor, and you're thinking about which of these four funds, which seem to outperform the S&P 500, you would recommend to your client, okay? Here's the tobacco fund. Okay, this is for a few brave souls who, want to go tobacco. Then this orange is the Alpha Investment Fund. And then we have the Fortitude Fund, this kind of grayish purple line. And then finally the Power Trade Investment Fund in yellow. And it's your job to decide which of those you're going to pick. And I can give you another 14 seconds, and then we'll ask you to raise your hand. Okay, how many brave souls are going to admit that they want to go tobacco? Okay, that didn't go over well. Okay, Alpha. Alpha. All right, that's an Alpha. Okay, Power Trade. Okay, and Fortitude. Okay, why Fortitude? Less volatility, okay. Okay, those of you who were for Alpha, do you see any problem with Fortitude? Any problem? Yes, please.
Is Alpha the second one?
Alpha's yellow, and that kind of grayish line is Fortitude.
Oh.
Going, yeah.
The gray line, they're smoothing their earnings.
There's, what do you think they're doing?
There's no volatility.
Yeah, that's a good thing, right? Investors don't like volatility.
Well, they're doing something so that they're avoiding volatility.
They're doing something to avoid volatility. Anyone else? Yeah.
Failing to capture the upside.
Okay.
It has less profit in the long run.
Less profit. Anyone else? Yeah.
It's not very natural.
It's not very natural. What do you mean natural? This is a stock fund.
Because the market won't behave in such a consistent way.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing. I mean, it's like if you see that and it's not natural, it's got to be a red flag. You should be.
A red flag. Okay, so let's move to the next chart. We're going to look just at Fortitude for all you Fortitude investors. And there you go, that was Madoff. So you picked Madoff, as lots of other feeder funds did. Okay. And if you ask finance folks, are these returns possible? Okay. Is it possible to consistently outperform the market without volatility? The answer to that question is no. Now, some of you would claim I only gave you about 14 seconds, and you don't even have a degree in finance. But what I'm arguing is that there are lots of experienced professionals who did have advanced degrees in appropriate topics, and who did not notice that Madoff's returns were not possible, that you cannot outperform the market by that amount without having volatility. You also can't have a fund that outperforms the market without volatility. It doesn't, to some degree, follow the market. Okay, so the pattern just doesn't make sense. There were massive red flags, and there were hundreds of people who had the knowledge base and did nothing about this. Now, there's one guy who claims he did. How many of you remember Harry Markopoulos? Okay, now Harry's a very interesting man. So this may help remind the rest of you. After Madoff was arrested, Harry showed up and said, I told the SEC 3 times. And he liked the SEC slightly less than he liked Madoff. And it is true that he went to the SEC 3 times and said there's a problem with Madoff. He's written a book. You can read his letters, which are in the back of his book, to the SEC. And the guy who sort of noticed, interestingly enough, did everything imaginable to keep the SEC from noticing and paying attention. Okay. To begin with, his documentation, while he ended up being right, is not readable by me. Now, I'm not a finance professor, but I teach at a business school. Okay. And I have an undergraduate degree in accounting, so that's not the touchy-feely stuff. I can't make sense out of what he gave the SEC. Second, if you read his book, oh, by the way, and most of what I'm saying now comes from a book by Diana Hendricks, who wrote a book on Madoff, and she's not a big fan of Harry Markopoulos. If you read Markopoulos' book, it becomes clear that he's among the most sexist human beings that you would ever encounter in a business context. And the first people he ran into the SEC happened to be female professionals, and they wanted him out of their office as fast as possible. Okay. Finally, best evidence is that he never knew it was a Ponzi scheme. He thought it was front-loading. Front-loading is different than a Ponzi scheme. Since Madoff cleared trades, if he knew what trades were coming down the pike and he put his own trades in front of it, he could take advantage of market movements that he saw coming. And there's lots of reasons to believe that Markopoulos, in fact, thought it was a front-loading scheme rather than a Ponzi scheme, which are very, very different in terms of the implications both for the people who own Madoff shares, but also very different implications on whether Harry Markopoulos would collect a fee from the US government for turning him in. And he would collect a fee for front-loading, but not for the Ponzi scheme issue. Finally, and this is the best thing that Diana Hendricks points out, is if this guy's a Ponzi scheme, do you tell the SEC, here's 30 pages of uninterpretable information for you to try to read? Or do you tell them, why don't you give a call to the clearinghouse that would have cleared Madoff's trades? And if he had done that, a 15-minute phone call could have found Madoff many, many years before he was eventually found to be guilty. So the one guy who sort of noticed something was amazing at not noticing what would affect the likelihood of other people noticing. Okay. Now there are people who do notice, okay? And to begin with, Warren Bennis, who's a hero over at the Center for Public Leadership and recently passed away, very good guy. He didn't make up the name First Class Noticer, but he borrowed it from a Saul Bellows short story about Harry Trellerman, who Bellows describes as a First Class Noticer. And Bennis argued that a key aspect of leadership is to become a First Class Noticer. Okay. And there are people out there who are First Class Noticers. To begin with, if we think about the recent housing meltdown, Lewis's book The Big Short does an amazing job of identifying people who did notice. Unfortunately for us, they acted on it for their own massive financial benefit, which they're really legally entitled to do. And nobody in government really had access to this information to do anything about it. Michael Lewis, I love Michael Lewis's writing. He also wrote Moneyball, some of you have seen the movie, which is about Billy Beane, who basically noticed that the intuition of baseball managers was lousy. And that if we substituted statistics for intuition, you could transform an industry, and it's transformed not only baseball, but basically all of sports now pays attention to statistics in a dramatically different way. And finally, I want to tell you about the ambassadors. So Patty Bellinger, who introduced me, is my friend. But before she was my friend, she was my client. In December 2004, she showed up at the Harvard campus to hire some professor for a course on diplomacy for the top 75 executives in British Petroleum, back in the days when they were a good company. You probably remember that. And I basically said to her, I don't teach diplomacy, in fact I'm not even diplomatic. But we were at Henrietta's table and good breakfast, and she said, but if you did teach diplomacy, what would it be? Which was a strange question, but I think my answer was something like, it would be about making decisions and negotiating in foreign distant lands where the other side doesn't play by your rules. Anyhow, Patty and her colleagues liked that. And they hired me to teach these 75 executives, roughly 12 at a time. And I've never run into any corporation in my life that spent so much time and devotion to working to create the best program that possibly could. So we spent a large amount of time creating this course. And it had to do with cases in foreign distant lands. And the first time we were going to teach it, my schedule did not mesh up that well with the executives. So it turned out that I may have the days off, but you'll get the idea. I was teaching on Tuesday here and teaching in London on Wednesday morning. So I took the red-eye. I sleep on planes okay. And I was really good at it back in 2005. So I flew overnight, arrived in London, a car is waiting for me. I get to a castle where the course was being held. It's a famous castle. It's where the British government almost fell. Clinton?
Yes.
Yeah. And I quickly take a shower when I arrive, and it's now maybe a half hour before the start of class. I walk over, I grab some coffee, and Patty and her team then introduced me to three kind of distinguished looking guys. So there's kind of a dozen executives, there's some staff folks who work for Patty who I know, and then there's three older looking guys who look quite distinguished, and I'm introduced to them almost like I'm supposed to know who they are. And I don't remember if it was Patty or one of the folks who work for Patty explained to me that they were my special advisors. And I was completely clueless. So I pulled over a younger staff member who was a little on the more informal side, and I said, okay, who are they? And I basically was told, well, you told us that you've only spent a limited number of days in the countries where the cases took place. So we thought it would be useful for you to have some expertise in the room that you could call on when you needed some background on the socioeconomic environment at the time. And two of these guys were ambassadors from the UK to the country in the cases, and the third was number 2 at MI6. Okay, and they were my special advisors, and I could call on them. So now it's like 15 minutes before the start of class, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do with these guys? So class starts, and I didn't really need to worry about how I was going to get them involved. That morning, their hands were up regularly. making comments that I found bizarre at best. And I found them annoying. I had this intense dislike of them. And they were making me miserable. And here's the interesting part. By the end of the day, I love these guys. Okay, and my account of what was going on was that the executives, as well as myself, we were good at focusing on the problem as defined. And what these ambassadors were good at was thinking about the second and third order effects that the rest of us in the room were missing. And I think that my experience with the ambassadors really helped me realize that there's other layers of complexity that have amazing information in them that is enormously valuable. So I often think about the ambassadors in terms of becoming better noticers. So I think there are some steps that we can take. We can put noticing on our agenda. We can try to take an outsider's view. If we step back from the moment of decision, we can often do a better job of seeing a broader perspective. We can audit our organization to identify why it is that people don't notice. We can identify changes that would create a more noticing organization, so we can eliminate conflicts of interest that keep us from noticing. And when something's wrong, we could try to figure out what's going on. So if we go back to April 30th, 2005, I sort of thought something was wrong. But like many of you, when something is wrong, it doesn't come at a time where someone gives you a problem. Is there something wrong? Okay, it comes in the midst of life when you're busy doing lots of other things. So I remained busy through May and into March. On June 17th, 2005, I was in London working for Patty, and I woke up that morning at 5 a.m. A little bit of jet lag, and I opened up my computer to look at the New York Times. And I read a story about a guy named Matthew Myers. He's the president of Tobacco Free Kids and one of the leading anti-tobacco guys in the world. And he was also an expert in the RICO case. And what I then read was an account of how Robert McCollum, the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, had attempted to corrupt his testimony. And I proceeded to basically read the same story that I told you about my experience on April 30th. It was almost identical. Now there I was in London at midnight, at 5 a.m. midnight back in Boston, and like I had this overwhelming sense, boy did I screw up. Like, I don't know who I was supposed to talk to, but I was supposed to do something other than forget about that episode. What I did do is I woke up Marla, that's that woman in the back of the room, and I said, I got a complex one, I think you need to wake up for this one. And then I basically brought her up to date on what had happened, and Marla knew more about Washington than I did. And I said, I think I'm supposed to do something about this, but I don't know what to do. And by the way, in a few hours while you're still sleeping, I need to go off to work for the day. So I said, I'll call you again when I get back to the hotel at 5 p.m., about 12 hours later. So 12 hours later, I call Marla, and she says, you're supposed to call Lewis Clark at the Government Accountability Project. He represents whistleblowers. He's your attorney. He'll give you some more coaching. After you talk to him, a reporter at the Washington Post is waiting for your story. Okay. Now, so it turns out that if I had asked Marla what to do, she could have figured this out much earlier. And I probably even knew other people who could have figured out what I should do. But I didn't do anything on April 30th. And I think that this is a common state of affairs. Sort of, it wasn't that I lacked the courage to say something. It was more, I was overwhelmed, the evidence was ambiguous, I wasn't sure what was occurring, and life just moved on. So soon the Washington Post covered the story, but I've always appreciated what Matt Myers provided. Now, there's lots on the tobacco story which I won't go into. There's a book, this book, Bad Acts, provides a history of the tobacco litigation, including the attempts of Robert McCollum to corrupt the testimony of expert witnesses. And I'm just going to close with this picture. Only some of you are old enough to remember this fabric. It was called Kiana. It was slippery, so if you spilled anything on it, it would slide right off. And you'll notice this young man has quite thick glasses and a very nice head of hair. And the last thing I'll tell you is that this is me. I think age 17, and I was a very, very, very good card player. And I'm playing in a bridge tournament. And the reason I show you this, and I'm trying to justify my terrible noticing, is that in this task, and it need not be bridge, it could be any card game, the task is to pay attention to 52 cards and the other players who are at the table. And everything else is a distraction. And what I want to highlight is that leadership doesn't have this particular attribute. Other stuff in the environment is important. The problem in front of you is not fully defined. We don't know what all the pieces are that matter. And there are many tasks where focusing is quite rewarded. But for me, a big message of the book, because my guess is that we have more focusers and noticers in this room, because I think focusing is so well rewarded, is that most of us focusers are probably well served to occasionally pick up our head and notice as well. So with that, I'm going to stop, and if you have any comments, questions, disagreements, go for it. Harvard Law School, it's a shy place. Yes, please.
Can you say more about your last point about why focus is an important leadership?
I think focus is really important. I don't want to give up being focused. I just think that those of us who focus should realize that we probably miss some stuff as well. Okay? And that stuff that we miss may be critically important. So, one of the amazing facts about the 9/11 episode that I went over so quickly, nobody was fired. Nobody in the US government was fired for allowing 9/11 to happen, even though many people really screwed up. But it wasn't on anybody's agenda to keep airplanes from flying into buildings. So if everybody was doing everything that was on the checklist, everything that was on their objectives for the year, everything that was on their to-do list, that isn't enough. And it has to be somebody's job to figure out those things that aren't part of the focus that we naturally have in front of us. Yes, please.
Can you say a little bit about the relationship between intuition, or what we might call gut, and what you are thinking of or defining as noticing?
That's one of my favorite questions. So there are some hard questions that I don't like. I love that one. So let me start by highlighting the fact that I do consider Malcolm Gladwell's book Blake to be the worst book in the history of the world. Okay. It's basically wrong, and it's written so well that people will remember it for the rest of their lives. Modern psychology just has done an amazing job of identifying the systematic and predictable ways in which judgment, including executive judgment, is deficient, and how we can improve things when we provide more analytic thought to important problems. So for lots of unimportant things, I think your intuition's just terrific. But for big things, we need to stop and we need to think, and our intuition leads us astray. The way Billy Beane became famous is basically realizing how bad Malcolm Gladwell's advice is. Malcolm Gladwell, by the way, used to be a really good writer, but he gave that up for selling books and fame in ways that that's very frustrating, because I teach a lot of executives, and sort of conveying to them that they need more systematic thought in a variety of ways is harder to do, because Malcolm Gladwell is so well appreciated for telling them that their intuition is just wonderful. Gladwell also kind of dramatically misrepresents his work, because if you hear him do an interview, he'll talk about the balanced treatment. But you need to get to the kind of fourth chapter before you get to anything about the problems of intuition. So intuition is probably good for signaling things that we need to think more systematically about. Intuition is really good for allowing us to move forward on lots of small problems quickly. But for important decisions that you make, use your intuition with caution.
Could you tell us how you really feel about Malcolm Gladwell?
The same as you, Michael. Yes, please.
Hi. I'm wondering if you could say something about the relationship between power perspectives and noticing. I think Alan Belinsky has
Yeah.
written that people who perceive themselves to be more powerful are less likely to be good at perspective taking
Yeah.
or noticing.
So I have a couple of social psychologists behind me here, so they may be able to help. I think that the argument is basically that higher levels don't need to notice the perspective of others, whereas people at lower levels do need to identify the perspective of people above them, and that creates a differential. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
So, but what were you thinking with your question?
Well, I'm just wondering how this might affect people's inclination to notice, as leaders, what do we need to keep in mind as we're trying to notice?
Yeah.
You know, in terms of how we think about ourselves, how we think about the other.
Yeah.
I'm
So,
thinking particularly of negotiation situations, which is what I deal with.
sure. So it seems like leaders are different from a negotiator who doesn't have leadership responsibility, in the sense that leaders need to monitor the decisions of other people who work for them. So we need to not only notice ourselves, but we need to think about what kind of conditions are we creating. So for example, one group of negotiators might be salespeople. And we could easily create conditions for salespeople where we reward them based on their sales volume. And it may be the case that some customers don't even end up paying their bills. But if the salesperson sort of gets rewarded for selling, whether or not the money ever comes in or not, well, they might not notice that this person's a bad credit, that this other company's a bad credit risk. So it seems like you as a leader, you want to be able to think about what conditions are you creating for other people to notice, and to think about the overall organization as well. For a negotiator, him or herself, I think that the biggest thing that negotiators fail to notice are the decisions of the other party, particularly when the other side hasn't even made that decision yet. So how are you supposed to notice decisions that haven't been made yet? Well, that's what the field of game theory is all about. Now, I'm not an enormous fan of the rationality assumption, which is part of formal game theory, but I'm an enormous fan of the propensity of game theory to get people to think systematically about the likely response of the other side, which I think we have pretty good empirical evidence that people aren't particularly good at. So you're looking like I didn't answer I thought I answered like 3 different versions of your question. Like, no, I missed it entirely. So if you want to try again, I'll do my best.
Well, I think negotiation is a leadership skill.
Yeah.
I think noticing is a leadership skill. Perspective taking is a leadership skill.
I agree with all that.
And my experience is that people who perceive themselves to have more power than other people in a situation seem to have less ability to notice.
And that's consistent with the Galinsky piece that you were mentioning.
Which is
I believe that, yeah.
So given all of these things, and given that leaders tend to have more power than other people,
Yeah.
that they're dealing with. I'm wondering, how do we deal with this, this contradiction? That leaders need to be able to notice more, and yet something about the leadership position puts them in a position where they're less likely to notice.
So it may be that focusing is so well rewarded that you get focusers rather than noticers who move up, but that's just a possibility. But I guess my intuition, so I tend to not focus very much on individual differences in my work, and so whether we're talking about noticing skill or negotiation skill, I believe that there's variation, whether it comes from nature or early childhood development is well beyond my expertise. But I believe that there's variation. But I think that, when we teach people how to create value in negotiation, or we teach people how to notice more effectively, sort of the people at the top have plenty of room to learn how to do it better, and the people at the bottom obviously have lots of room as well. So I think that noticing is something that most of us need to learn to do better. And I'm less concerned about the individual difference aspect that you're suggesting based on position, but I don't doubt that that exists. Yes, sir?
How does multiculturalism or coming from another culture help you be a better observer?
Yeah, so there's some work, I know some of it, not all of it, and I'm far from an expert on cultural differences, but there's some work that shows that biculturalism leads to greater perspective taking, okay, that by growing up in two different cultures, you notice the need to think about their world because you're switching between cultures, and some work that suggests that biculturalism leads to greater creativity. I believe all that, but I'm far from an expert on that. Whether it leads to greater noticing, I think we can think through that with the logic of how it might. I certainly haven't seen any information on biculturalism on some of the standard noticing tasks. But that might be there, and I just haven't seen that. Yeah, please.
Yes. I was wondering, in your courses or in your sessions, how you bring about better noticing. I think that negotiation or communication, you can practice it in a classroom setting, but something like this where you're just supposed to be perceptive, how do you teach?
Well, first of all, the first full week of January, I teach an entire module, all in 1 week, at the Kennedy School. It's called Noticing. But we cover decision making, we cover negotiation, we cover ethics. We have a really good session on magic. So we cover the topic of there are people out in the world who don't want you to notice. Todd Rogers is sitting here. He's written, Mike Norton too is co-author. Yeah, these guys have written an amazing paper on dodging, looking at how politicians, when they don't want to answer your question that you've asked them, how they dodge. So basically they answer, ideally if they're going to be effective, a related question, so you think that your question's been answered. Politicians may be people who don't want you to notice when they're doing something like not answering your question. So we cover a realm of different kinds of topics, and hopefully through that experience help people become a bit better at noticing as a result. Yes, please.
Can you elaborate on what made the ambassadors in your third example such good noticers, why you were struck by them?
So I don't know the answer to that, but I'm willing to speculate on most things that I don't know the answer to. So I can easily believe that there's something in their training. So all three of them were very British, and what they learned at Oxford, I think they were all Oxford. Cambridge, okay. I'm not sure about, but they were also, I would guess, in their 60s when they showed up in this class. I assume that they had been through many episodes where they probably were surprised by things that happened that they, over time, may have learned how to anticipate. But I don't really know the answer to that. But it was strikingly different than what I experience with corporate managers on a more regular basis. Yeah. Please.
I'm curious whether there was anything you noticed in this room that affected the way you conducted this session. And ask this question more as a teacher, trying to think about what I might want to notice in the room that might affect the way I teach.
Oh, wow. No, I'm not socially sophisticated enough to adapt like that. That's probably the truth. So because this is at PON, and I thought that there would be more legal folks here, so I did go back, and so part of the reason I have some more interesting quotes here that depending on questions I might I still might use, but I probably won't. But this is kind of like an amazing history of the tobacco industry. So I prepared more thoroughly so that I was fresh on some of the legal aspects of what was happening around me. And for those of you who wonder, was I being overly mean to Robert McCollum? Sharon Eubanks doesn't like him nearly as well as I do. She worked for him and she kind of provides a detailed chronology of his behavior in this book. So I prepared certain elements in advance, but I don't think that my guess is, rumor has it you're an amazing teacher, but I don't think I'm socially sophisticated enough to have adapted in any particular way based on when I came in the room. Yeah. Yes, please.
In thinking about why people don't notice in the first place,
Yeah.
in your experience, is it more a fundamental human behavior issue, or is it more the incentives that are set up?
I think that, I'm speculating, but I think that there's so many tasks, particularly early in life, where focusing is rewarded more than noticing. I mean, I don't know, Marla and I will go to a restaurant, and on the way out, she'll tell me about everything that was happening among the relationships of the couples at the 3 tables around us. And I'll say, like, what about me? So she just notices stuff that would just clearly escape my attention. But it's not like I regret the fact that I spent all my life focusing. I just wish that I had spent 3% of time noticing. But I do think it comes from the fact that we're rewarded for focusing so much. Yes, please.
Perfect segue. In your research or experience, did you ever notice any gender differences in noticing?
So I think that there's some visual stuff that suggests that women are slightly better noticers than men, but I'm forgetting whose work I just. Oh, Nick Epley. Nick Epley wrote a terrific book on decision making, and one of the things, and I always bring this result up when people bring up any gender difference. So it seems useful to answer the question accurately if one gender is better at something than the other gender. But what Epley highlights is in most cases, when there's a gender difference, people know what direction it goes, and they overestimate the magnitude of the difference by about 4. So basically, you have 2 highly overlapping distributions, and people are imagining, because there's a gender difference, particularly if the media reports it, that you have 2 different curves sitting next to each other. And I think that most of the noticing is going to have that flavor. That if I have to bet, if the only data I have is male or female and the task is noticing, I'll go with the female. But that's not going to do a great job of predicting. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if there's certain professions that have, nothing to do with anything. Policemen or performers that maybe are really good noticers, and if there's lessons to be learned by that.
Yeah. So improv.
That's where I was going.
Folks seem to be good at that.
Yeah.
I hope that intelligence people are good at that. Are good at this. But again, consistent with the other question, the earlier comment, my guess is that improv people can learn to notice better, and I'm sure that intelligence officers can learn to notice better. Yeah. Wow.
I think many of the problems you've identified is what I characterize as not noticing.
Right.
And that is something in the context, something that's going on that you don't focus on, you don't realize, you don't understand. It turns out ex post to be very important. And I guess it relates to work.
I don't accept that ex post. I would argue at 9/11, we had lots of information ex ante that we should have fixed there.
No, but you see, it turns out that after most tragedies, of any sort,
Yeah.
child abuse, anything else, you look at the cases backwards, and you can find all kinds of things that, quote, might have been noticed that would have led you to predict this. The problem is, it doesn't tell you about all the false positives.
Yeah.
Where you might have also predicted it. And I think that's a real complicated factor. In all of this, I think that the reason, and let me finish the question, and I
Okay.
disagree with a lot of it.
Yeah.
I think not noticing is often because you're using a particular framework, maybe cognitive, some model, some mental model of what you're looking at. And maybe culturally influenced, where you learn to look at some things but not other things. And you're usefully telling us that you should at least be aware of what your prisms are and why you may not be noticing some things. And I think there are probably a lot of different reasons people have blind spots. And I guess I'm very suspicious of dividing the world between noticers and focusers. Because I think that, in fact, people in this room probably are very good at focusing on some things, but maybe not other things. They may be pretty good at noticing some things, but not other things. And I wonder why you feel the bifurcation is useful.
Oh, so first of all, I don't mean to put people into one bucket or the other than for some illustration purposes. So my goal isn't to switch from being a focuser to a noticer. My goal is that for
Try to do both.
and certainly those of us who are heavily focused need to notice a bit more, and then we can develop the tools for doing that, and we can provide leaders with insight about how to change our organization to do that. But sort of on the comment where you very nicely accused me possibly of the hindsight bias, I'm going to claim I'm innocent. So certainly I did not know about 9/11. I did not predict 9/11. I did predict an Enron-like activity in a paper 4 years before Enron collapsed, in a paper called The Impossibility of Enron, The Impossibility of Auditor Independence. I think that was, that one I'm
Because of a big structural problem.
Exactly.
That created the wrong kinds of
Exactly.
incentives.
It was, so that was,
It's an important thing.
so that was done a priority. So just to highlight, if it wasn't clear, I was accusing Robert McCullum, who was a Bush appointee, of being the corrupt guy in that story, just to be clear. It's relevant to what I'm going to say next. There are lots of government reports saying you need to be worried about X, Y, and Z, and we can't respond to all of them. But airline safety is different. And what makes airline safety different is that in 1996, a guy named Al Gore, he was vice president, his most important task that year was chairing the Gore Aviation Security Commission report. And basically there was a September 1996 draft of that report that if we had implemented, 9/11 would not have occurred. And it was called the final draft. And what happened next is that airlines changed their contributions from Republicans to Democrats, including the Clinton-Gore re-election campaign. Al Gore's never mentioned the term airline security ever since. And in February 1997, soon after they easily won re-election, another draft of the report came out that had been gutted of all of the tough messages that was in the September 96 draft. Now,
So that's something that was noticed, but then was corruptly
not acted on, yeah. And I think that a lot of stuff happens in a fuzzy land between noticing and acting. Okay, so did I notice on April 30th? Sort of. I know I didn't act. Okay, but if you ask me where was the breakdown, I can't even tell you, and it's my story, and I'm willing to talk about it. And I think that so often we have a gap between some level of noticing and action, where the necessary parties don't fully notice the magnitude of the problem. And I'm arguing that that existed on 9/11. I think that we absolutely should have fixed airline security by early 1997 at the latest. We screwed up. So for me, that's just one that people often talk about is, in hindsight, we should have fixed airline security, and I just want to, my view is, a priority, we should have fixed airline security. Yeah. Yes, please. By the way, we're overtime, so there's food and you're allowed to walk out and whatever you like, yeah. So, but I have nowhere to go, yeah.
A lot of your stories, you talk about, using this as a preemptive to avoid problems.
Yeah.
Would you say that a level of almost not pessimism, but suspicion, pragmatism, kind of need to be a part of your thinking to notice things?
It depends on what you do. I mean, I don't think everybody, but I think that people in the military and in intelligence who are in charge of the government's financial systems, yeah, I think that's exactly, that should be part of their job. Do I think leaders need these skills, leaders of large organizations of all types? Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, please.
Do you think for leaders or managers, it helps to give people less well-defined questions or tasks? Even that if I have a very focused task, I may go after the known unknowns and ignore the impacts of the unknown unknowns.
Yeah, so I think that overly specified goals have a very nasty downside. And that is when you give people very clear goals on a subset of the dimensions on which you want them to perform, they don't perform on those other subsets, and they also cheat to perform on the goals that you do specify. So I think you want to notice that those are the potential risks of providing that clarity. Yeah. Hank?
Yeah, you're talking about the tobacco case that you were involved in. You kind of noticed, it's not clear what action you could have taken. I mean, this was a case where basically the government was torpedoing their own lawsuit. And what would you have done? You were a hired hand. All you,
I would have been much happier if I called the Times or the Post, if I had found Louis Clark and asked him for advice on what do you do when you're in the middle of these situations. I did nothing. I didn't even check out what I should have done. I think I goofed. I didn't even ask Marla to figure this out for me.
You see, part of it, though, it really relates to what was said about intuition.
Yeah.
You did have an intuition, this is weird.
Yeah.
And you talk about the difference between
that
and the action. But the intuition said something to you that analytically you didn't understand. And I think that often, this is consistent with what you said. This is consistent with what you said.
Yeah.
Thinking fast can be a form of intuition or cognition that can lead you, then maybe use the slow part of your mind to push further.
Yep. Yes. Paul? And well, maybe we'll make this the last question so we can eat food.
Should be the last question. I was thinking about emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Noticing, and I think a lot of things that people don't notice in a lot of important situations cause a lot of heartbreak and also make a lot of shortcuts is people lack emotional intelligence or they don't focus on emotional things. And that's allowed to notice and it doesn't go on in day-to-day life. And as well as the important negotiations of businesses.
I think a lot of the social stuff has that character.
And how you teach emotional intelligence.
There's a lot of people working on that, but that's only a subset of the kinds of things we don't notice. Yeah. So, okay. I think why don't we end here? I'm happy to talk.